Hello everybody and welcome. This is Word of Info and we're starting right away with Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University, Dua Mohammed at the controls and Najla Naguib, and we're with you until 5 o'clock, so stay with us. Let my body do the work. Yes, back again, World of Info, and we're starting right away. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
So we are starting with Word of Books today.
Yes, and you know the rule of the game.
Yes.
What is the rule of the game?
Toss it, read it, or skim it. Or throw it.
Throw it, yes. And usually it is read it. And today we are presenting 4 books. Very interesting books because they are, as always, as usual, related to Egypt, because this is Radio Cairo. So to the 4 books that have been recently put in the market, some of them are very recent and others are new editions, are the following. Farouk Hosni, Remembering Times of Culture, a dialogue with Intisar Dardir. The second book is The United States of America and the Egyptian-Israeli Conflict, 1967-1979, by Dr. Inji Muhammad Ghanedi. And on the other side, Dr. Sami Amara, Cairo, Moscow, Documents and Secrets, from 1958-52 till 1986. And the last but not least, Nazli, A Queen in Exile, by Rawia Rashid. So, 4 interesting books today, and we'll discuss, giving 15 minutes for each book. Maybe this will attract your attention to read them, and I tell you, and I can promise you, that these 4 books carry a lot of interesting novel information.
Okay, interesting. Back again, Word of Info, and you can call us at 257-89407. This is Word of Info. So back again, Word of Info and the books.
Well, we have to start chronologically because these 4 books are historical books. They are related to periods of history of Egypt, 20th century and the late 20th century, and of course early 21st. So we'll start by the oldest of them, not in the oldest in the sense of the oldest in publishing, yes, but the oldest about speaking about the period. And this is, of course, Nazli, A Queen in Exile. Well, whenever I read anything about the royal family of Egypt, and whenever I read about exactly the saga and the drama of the life and times of King Farouk and his father, King Fuad, and of course his mother, Queen Nazli, I always feel mesmerized, and I really find myself in really great trouble, because I really don't know how this family has reached the peak of everything and reached the downhill and the deepest depth of real jeopardy, poverty and everything. How can a family start at the peak and goes downhill that rapidly in a very short period? I really cannot understand. And nobody can really understand how much this family has suffered, and nobody has really could understand what I'm saying except by reading the lives and the times of Nazli, the mother of King Farouk. A lady who belonged to a very rich and very well-established family. Her great-grandfather was Suleiman Pasha, or the Colonel Save, who was a French officer. There is some misinformation in the book that he worked in the French expedition to Egypt. Actually, he didn't. But anyway, Colonel Save was a French officer that came to the service of Muhammad Ali and has helped him in forming a really tough Egyptian army that was under his supervision, acting as the chief of staff for the commander-in-chief of this great army, Ibrahim Pasha, the son of Muhammad Ali. Save has become a real genius general, and he was able to make a new army, a modern army of the Egyptians at that time. He has converted to Islam and became a Muslim himself, married to a Muslim lady, has a daughter, and this daughter later on married to Sharif Pasha, and who was the Prime Minister of Egypt. And Sharif Basha has had a daughter, and this daughter has had another daughter, and after marrying Abdurrahim Sabri Basha, and there we are with the daughter of Abdurrahim Sabri Basha and the great-granddaughter of Suleiman Basha the French, or Suleiman Basha Francawi, and this is Nazli. Nazli was young. She got married at a very young age, and she got a divorce from her husband, and then she was married to King Fuad, who was also a divorcee. But he was 17 or 18 years her senior, and she gave birth to the prince of the throne, or Farouk, and 3 of his sisters. Actually 4. Fawziyya, Faiza, Faiqa, and Fathiyya. So when we're talking about Nazli, who was the queen mother, and at the same time married to the king Fuad, who kept her, knowing that she was very young and looked very attractive. He kept her inside the palace in such a golden cage. King Fuad was suffering from some illness and from old age, died in 1936. And Nazli was able to secure the assent of her son, who was almost very ill-educated because he didn't have the chance to have a proper certified education. And on the throne, he reached the throne when he was 17 years old, and his age was calculated according to lunar months to be 18 in 1937. And she even made him get married as early as possible to a beautiful young lady by name of Sarfinaz, and who later changed her name to a letter F as well, by Farida, the Queen of Hearts of the Egyptians. And Farida gave birth to 3 girls, and of course didn't bring him the son or the crown prince. So the queen was a widow in her mid-40s, and she found herself controlling her son and out of the golden cage after the death of her husband. What happened after that is really a mystery. How such a lady of great well upbringing and great life really changed dramatically, especially after the death of Ahmad Basha Hassanin, who was the chamberlain of the king, and there was a rumor that she was secretly married to him. After the death of Ahmad Hassanin, nobody really knows whether this was true or not, because there were no documents to be found. Anyway, after the death of Ahmad Hassanin, she suffered from a certain illness in her kidney, and she traveled abroad, taking her youngest 2 girls to Europe to have a treatment for her kidney disease. During the early times of her son getting to the throne, there was an arranged marriage between Fawziyya, the eldest of her daughters, to the Emperor or Shah Iran, the son of the Shah, and later on to become the Shah or the Emperor of Iran, and she became the Empress. And then things dramatically changed. When she was in Europe, she met one of the employees of the Egyptian embassy in France, who was coming from a very moderate family, and he was not from the same religion. He was a Coptic Egyptian, and she started to place her confidence in this young employee, and his name was Riyad Ghali. And then the young daughter, who was almost 16 or 17, Fathiyya, became emotionally involved with Riyad Ghali. And King Farouk sent a question to them and asked them to come back, because he has seen coming that Princess Fathiyya could get married to Riyad Ghali, and this is, of course, was against all the rules and traditions. However, Queen Nazli started to obstruct all the orders of her son. And she decided to make her Fathiyya get married to Riyad Ghali after changing nominally to Islam. And then she also allowed her elder daughter, her third daughter, Faiqa, to get married to a young diplomat in San Francisco after she traveled to the United States of America, and by the name of Fuad Sadiq. The king was very angry. Faiqa and Fuad Sadiq came to their senses and came back to Egypt, where their marriage was completely legalized under the auspice of her elder brother, while Fathiyya and Nazli stayed there. And Riyad Ghali started spending all their money and their fortunes unwisely and taking control of everything that the queen mother had in her hands. And to add more misery to the situation, Queen Nazli decided to become a Catholic and named herself Mary Elizabeth. People say that this was all as a sort of revenge of the king, who decided to dethrone her, remove the title from her and from her daughter Fathiyya. And things changed more and more when a revolution started, and in 1952 the king was removed from the authority and he was kicked out in exile to Rome. And after that things got worse and worse. Riyad Ghali went on spending their money until they were completely bankrupt by the year of 1972. The queen was completely bankrupt and passed into severe illness. And Fathiyya had to support all this family simply by working as a housekeeper in one of the hotels. It's very hard to imagine that a princess who started her life in a palace like Abdin Palace ends up by becoming a housekeeper. And most unfortunate is that she tried to get a divorce from Riyad Ghali, and she managed to do that. She had one daughter and two sons. President Sadat, in a good gesture, has decided to give her an Egyptian passport. And she was very happy to go back to Egypt. And she decided to pack up her things, receive the passport, and started arranging the final details of the travel. When suddenly Riyad Ghali asked her to come to his home and begged her, and when she went there, he simply killed her. He tried to commit suicide, and he failed in that also, to continue the misery of failure all through his life. Later on, he died 3 or 4 years later because he was unable to face the trial. He was sentenced to life sentence, but it couldn't be made on him because he was suffering from severe handicap from the bullet that he tried to commit suicide with. Later on, Queen Nazli died in 1978, 3 or 4 years after the death of her daughter. So, this is like a saga or a Bollywood movie or an old film of Hassan al-Imam in black and white of the Egyptian movies. If you hear this story and somebody say that somebody has written it, you would say, what a mess. Really, what is this type of writer? What is all this soap opera? Well, actually, these were the life and times of Queen Nazli in Egypt and in exile.
So back again, word of info, and you can call us at 2578-9407, more with word of books. So back again, word of info with word of books.
Well, the second book, chronologically speaking, is the book of Dr. Sami Amara. It's really very recently published, and it talks about Cairo, Moscow, Documents and Secrets, 1952-1986. And yes, what a book and what a history. Well, it talks about the Egyptian-Soviet relations, because until 1986 it was the Soviet Union. And it talks about how the relations progressed between Egypt and Moscow, or between Cairo and Moscow, at this very critical period of time. Well, the revolution of 1952 brought Muhammad Naguib nominally on the helm of power, but the one who was controlling everything and the threads were all in his fingers was Gamal Abdel Nasser. And for the Russians or for the Soviets, they didn't know really any information about Gamal Abdel Nasser. And to make things more complicated, the ambassador at that time, the Soviet ambassador at that time to Cairo, wasn't really very well informed about the situation. And he even was misinformed from a lot of the communist Egyptians who used to frequent the embassy prior to 1952, gave him a very unrealistic picture of Gamal Abdel Nasser and his fellow colleagues. And they have shown him more to be like more westernized and anti-communist or anti-Soviet talk. And things got worse when Gamal Abdel Nasser decided to send as an ambassador to the Soviet Union Lieutenant General Aziz al-Masri. When we talk about Aziz Pasha al-Masri, we'll talk about a very important nationalist figure of Egypt, a man of a great will and charm and wit and charm, and he was really the godfather of the whole officer corps. He was a hero. He fought with the Libyans against the Italians in the invasion of Libya by the Italians prior to 1909, and he was a very distinguished officer who received his training in Istanbul, and he received his staff college training in Germany. And therefore, he was always a very good speaker, like native speakers of German. And he spoke, of course, very fluent Turkish. And therefore, always he has been accused by having more or less German-like or German emotions towards Germany. And of course, it was very understandable that he liked the German, where he trained in his training in the staff college. And of course, the thing which was important is that Egypt was occupied by the Brits. So when the 1939 the war started, and at that time Aziz Pasha al-Masri was the chief of the Egyptian army staff, and the British thought that such a man would never be as a sympathizer to the Germans, should not stay as the chief of staff, and they were able to get rid of him by 1940-1941. And Aziz Pasha al-Masri decided that he is going to get some information and deliver it to Rommel, and he took one of the planes towards the Africa Corps, and the plane fortunately has ditched in a forced landing near Banha, and the two pilots, Amr Mabrouk and Hassan Zulfaqar Sabri, were able to flee, and together with Aziz Pasha al-Masri, who was later on arrested and stayed in a military jail for some time, and then he was released. So he was always treated as a nationalist hero, but he was not involved in the revolt of 1952. So as a sort of a compliment from the Egyptian revolutionaries, and at the same time to get him out of their back, because he was like a godfather, so he was able always to come in and give them instructions. So Gamal Abdel Nasser and his friends decided to send him to be an ambassador in Moscow. And for the Soviets, this was an insult, because the Soviets fought the Great War against the Germans and the Nazis. And for them to get a sympathizer with the Germans, with the German history of training and education, and even his trying to reach the Africa Corps, all this could have been proved to be an insult. At that time, Aziz Pasha al-Masri was quite old, and he was almost in his late 60s, early 70s, and he was not the type of very much concentrating at that period of time. And they even, Gamal Abdel Nasser decided to send with him a physician to be in charge of his health, and this physician name was Murad Ghalib, a man who was a professional physician, a lecturer in Cairo University, but at the same time became very much involved in diplomacy, and he was given the rank of a third secretary, and he stayed in Moscow for quite a long time with the famous Aziz Pasha al-Masri as his lieutenant. And when we look at Murad Ghalib, who with his perfect education, his command of English and later on his command of Russian, he became like a very important asset for Egypt, and he worked for a long period of time as an ambassador in the Cairo embassy in Moscow, and later on became a minister of foreign affairs. So when we look at what Sami Amara said, he found that in the first 3 to 4 years after the revolution, the Soviets looked with great skepticism to Nasser. When Nasser failed to get the proper funding from the World Bank and from the IMF to his project of the High Dam, he went to the other side, to the Soviets. When he asked the Americans and the Brits to supply him with arms and ammunition to defend Egypt from the consecutive and continuous attacks of the Israelis on the borders, he received a deaf ear. So it was his time, and he was forced to start negotiating and starting a relation with the Soviets. A relation that went on in 1956 with the bilateral support of the Soviets and the Americans against the invasion of Egypt by the tripartite armies. This, of course, were France, the UK, and Israel in 1956, following the nationalization of the Suez Canal. So the Soviets stood by Egypt, and so did Eisenhower, and there was a forced ceasefire was forced on these invading forces, and they were forced to retreat. After 1956, there was a sort of a confusion. Gamal Abdel Nasser started acting, trying to get a communication with the Soviets, trying to build up bridges of trust, and at the same time there was the non-aligned movement. And the Soviets looked with some skepticism to the non-aligned movement. And later on, when Nasser found out that some of the communists are acting against him, whether these were Egyptian communists or Syrian communists, he started attacking communism and attacking the Soviets, asking them and saying that they are trying to interfere or topple him. And of course, on the other side of the relation was Khrushchev himself, who was always known for being fiery and very easily aroused with reactions. So there was a silent war, of media war, between Egypt and the Soviet Union, starting from 1958 onwards until maybe 1961 or 1960s. And during this period, there was a sort of contact, there was a sort of support, there was a sort of trying to build bridges of support, and there was the connection of building the High Dam and the supply of the Egyptian army. 1967 has seen the great defeat of Egypt and the other Arab countries from Israel, and the complete dependence of Egypt on the arms and the experts, the Soviet experts coming from Soviet Union. However, in 1971, or the late 1970 and 1971, with Nasser's death and the ascent of Anwar Sadat to the power and the helm power, he decided, as we are going to see from the other book, that he is going to change directions. And he, because of the Soviets didn't supply him with all the arms and the munitions he wanted, always the arms were under the pile of arms that he was asking for were always not given to him properly, and not enough arms and ammunitions, and the right rockets and the right aeroplanes and the right tanks were never delivered. So Sadat decided to start war without the presence of the Russian experts on the Egyptian side. He kicked them out and started improving his relations with the United States of America, and abrupting and making the relation worsen day by day with the Soviet Union. It was in the invasion of the Soviet Union to Afghanistan that led to the Egypt severing the relations between the United USSR and Egypt in 1979 and 1980 onwards. A relation that were never returned except in 1984 in Mubarak's time. So the secrets and the documents of Cairo, Moscow, written by Dr. Sami Amara, It's a very interesting book to read. And the fact that Dr. Sami Amara has worked as a graduate from the Faculty of Tongues or Elson with a degree in Russian language and literature, he stayed for quite a long time as the correspondent of Al-Ahram in Moscow. He has received a PhD from there, and he has very strong connections and communications with the all aspects and powers of the Arabists in Moscow and the different ambassadors. And this book he has derived with carefully researched documents that were released from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Federal Republic of Russia. So reading a book from such a great, knowledgeable man deserves to be read and to be cherished as well. Dr. Sami Amara, Cairo, Moscow, Documents and Secrets, 1952-1986.
Great. Nice, interesting book. And we'll take a break and we'll be back with Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University. And you can call us at 257-89407 for any books that you have read and you would like to present. So back again, word of info and the third book.
Well, the third book is another interesting book. We are talking from the other side. And yes, the United States of America and the Egyptian-Israeli conflict, 1967-1979. It's by Dr. Enji Muhammad Ghanidi, and it's her PhD. Wow. To find two very carefully researched books with a lot of documents speaking about the relationship between Egypt and the two superpowers at that time is really of great interest. And to face that these two books are almost released in the same time in Cairo or during the recent years, this is interesting. And the fact that Dr. Sami Amara was talking first-hand information from his presence and work in the Soviet Union and his permit to examine all the Soviet documents, and at the same time his careful understanding of the Russian language made it easy for him to read all these documents in the wordings and the writings of the different ambassadors of the Soviet Union to Egypt, gives us another perspective. Is Dr. Enji Muhammad Ghanidi what she has done, because she went there to the United States to get her own documents of the relation between Egypt and the United States, not only from 1967 till 1979 as she has mentioned in her book or the main topic of her thesis, but she has given us a resume from 1952 onwards. And when we discuss and read parts of this book, we'll understand the whole story, or will we not understand anything of the story? Well, actually, this is left to you. There is documents that can make you shiver. There are paperwork, there is a narration, there are documentation, recordings of the phone calls that went between Kissinger and Golda Meir, between Kissinger and Anwar Sadat, and between Rogers and William Rogers and the interim between the Egyptian government during Nasser's time, and how Nasser accepted the Rogers initiative. And it gives us first-hand information about the American ambassador in 1967, prior to 1967 war. The documents that went through and through, really, this is very interesting. The talks and the phone calls that has been recorded and then put on lining and written and kept, very well kept, in the archives of the United States of America, gives you an impression, an understanding of how the negotiations of peace treaty between Egypt and Israel started, and how that in the 1950s Nasser has approached the United States, and the relation between Egypt and the United States has been dramatically stopped and put to an end simply by the interference from Israel at that time and the lobbying. Well, all this, when we read and we understand, we try to understand what happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and how things have changed the face of Egypt. Or was it the fate that was bringing everything to its direction? When we read this book, which is carefully researched, I would suggest that you don't only read the letters or the writings, but you should always read the references, because when you read the references, you'll get to understand that this is completely documented. So, a book by Dr. N.G. Muhammad Ghanidi, United States of America and the Egyptian-Israeli conflict, 1967-1979, a book that deserves to be read for you to understand part of the story.
So back again, word of info, and you can call us at 2578-9407. So back again, word of info and the fourth book.
Yes, the final book is a very interesting book. I warn you, yes, it is Farouk Hosni, Remembering Time of Culture. Well, this book is not written by Farouk Hosni, but it was based on an interview, a very long series of interviews that was made between Farouk Hosni and Mrs. Intisar Dardir. She's a writer, and she has put all the ideas and thoughts of Farouk Hosni. Sometimes it's written in the third person, sometimes it's written in the first person, but it's an interesting book. And the fact that it is giving us an idea of who is really Farouk Hosni, a man who was definitely a great artist and is a good administrator, because all his lifetime after graduating from the Faculty of Fine Arts in Alexandria, he has dedicated his life in working in the Ministry of Culture. So he's not, as some people think, that he's coming from outside of the system or jumping by parachute inside the Ministry of Culture. No, he has been an employee, a distinguished employee in the Ministry of Culture, and worked avidly in the one of what they call the cultural palaces of Egypt, which was a product of the active work of Sarwat Okasha in the 60s. A cultural palace is a place that in which the people can find a library, can find a place for acting, can find a place for painting. With all the culture aspects of life you can find in a cultural palace. And he was an employee in the cultural palace of Lamfushi, and later on the director of this cultural palace, where he was able to bring a lot of actors and theatrical shows and a lot of paintings and a lot of fairs. And he himself was a painter with a very special school of arts of expressionism and of surrealism. So this man was transferred to work as the director of the cultural center in France, in Paris, where he had more exposure to the French culture, and then later on had the chance to work in the as a deputy director and then a director of the cultural center in Rome. And of course the cultural center of Rome is one of the most prestigious places in the culture Ministry of Culture, where you have a great exposure. And during this period he learned, beside the French, of course, Italian, became very fluent in the Italian language. So it was the hand of fate that put Farouk Hosni in the helm of the Ministry of Culture in the late 80s. He became the Minister of Culture during the reign of the Prime Minister Atif Sadi, who has known him when he was the Cultural Council in France in the 80s, and when Farouk Hosni was the director in the late 70s, when Farouk Hosni was the director of the Cultural Center, the Egyptian Cultural Center in France. So whether this was a hand of luck or a vivid luck time or whatever chance, Farouk Hosni became the Minister of Culture. The moment he became a Minister of Culture, he has been subjected to a lot of attacks from every word of the culture people. Some people thought that he doesn't deserve this place. Other people thought that they deserve to be the ones in his shoes. And he started knitting a very strong network of relations between himself and all members of the cultural world, whether they were painters, artists, actors, cinema makers, whatever. Farouk Hosni was always able to build a strong relation with them. And this is what we can call him in terms like a political animal or a political human being who is always able to get into whatever fight or conflict and comes out victorious. How he was able to stay in the helm of power from 1986 till 2010 with the early days of 2011 with the revolution of January 2011. Nobody knows how he was able to survive except Farouk Hosni, and that's why it makes the book very interesting for us to read, because when you're going to read the book, you'll find that Farouk Hosni is giving us an idea of all the fights and the times that he was able to come out unscathed. His paintings are being always controversial. People were always mesmerized by his paintings, and his influence cannot be denied in certain aspects. Of course, the saving of the Sphinx, I believe this is one of the most important tasks that he was able to make. To save the Sphinx from the underground water and to completely resurrect it after the chances of its failure and loss could be attributed greatly to the work of Farouk Hosni. And of course, his administrative work in building the Alexandria Library and his important work in trying to do some renovations, especially over Mu'izz al-Din last Street, we cannot deny that of his agenda. We have a series of failures which he tried to defend himself during this book, and I believe that one of these failures was, of course, the fire of the Bani Suef theater. This was a great shock for him and for me personally, because I was involved in treating some of these patients. And yes, it was a very hard time, and he says that he has presented his resignation, and I believe this was one of the worst days of Egypt. The other important aspect, or one of the failures of Farouk Hosni, definitely is the grand theft of the Van Gogh painting. And of course it was stolen from Mohammed Mahmoud Khalil Museum, and I find that was very heartbreaking for me on the personal level, on the fact that one of the most precious paintings of Van Gogh, and the only one that is known to be Egypt, has disappeared mysteriously and never reappeared again. So when we are looking at the book and how he was trying to defend himself all through these aspects, the success and the failure of Farouk Hosni is a good name of the book. Yes, it was time of culture, but it was the failure and success of Farouk Hosni. The man was the Minister of Culture almost all through the reign of Hosni Mubarak, with failures and success. So, reading this book will give you a glimpse of how things were going in the field of culture for almost 23 years. So today I presented to you 4 interesting books about Egypt. I'm afraid not a single book could be tossed. The United States of America and the Egyptian-Israeli conflict, Sami Omara and the Cairo-Moscow documents and secrets, Nazli, a queen in exile, and last but not least, Farouk Hosni, Remembering Time of Culture.
Yes, and by this we come to the end of World of Info with Dr. Amr Mabrouk, Professor of Plastic Surgery at Ain Shams University. Dua Muhammad was at the controls. I'm Najla Naguib. See you next Thursday, same time, same station, FM 95.4.